Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into the world of Tritordeum today. It's a new cereal, and we're going to see how it could actually affect animal welfare.
Yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. We've got these two research studies from the University of Cordoba
Hmm.
in Spain. They're really interesting because they go beyond just looking at, how productive an animal is. They're looking at the whole well-being of the animal.
That's really cool. So before we get into those studies, can you tell me a little bit about what Tritordeum is? Like, what is this new cereal all about?
Okay, so picture this. You take the toughness of wild barley, right, and you combine it with the good stuff in durum wheat. Boom, you get Tritordium.
Ah, okay. So it's a hybrid of those two.
Exactly, a hybrid, yep. And because of that, it's got this totally unique genetic code, and that gives it some pretty awesome benefits.
So what does that unique genetic code mean for the sheep eating it?
Well, for starters, Tritordium is packed with nutrients, way more than your average wheat. Like, it's got 10 times the lutein, it's an antioxidant, super good for eye health, and get this, it's got more oleic acid too, which is a healthy fat, good for the heart.
Wow, it sounds like a superfood.
It kind of is, for sheep at least.
Okay, but it sounds like something that would be good for humans too, right?
You're absolutely right. It's actually already being used in some human foods.
Yeah.
One of the really neat things is that it's got less of those gluten proteins, the ones that can be hard to digest. Plus, it's full of fiber and prebiotics. Good for your gut.
So it's a win-win. Okay, so let's get to those studies now. The first one looks at how Tritordium compares to traditional oat pastures for pregnant ewes. So what were they trying to find out with this study?
So they were basically trying to see if those different diets, the tricordium versus the oats, how those impacted the overall health of the ewes and their stress levels. So they took some blood samples from the ewes.
Makes sense. So they took blood samples, and what exactly were they looking at in those samples?
Well, lots of things. For example, red blood cell count and white blood cell count. That can tell you a lot about the animal's health and how their immune system is doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how did they measure stress levels?
Oh, they used a bunch of different measures. One of them was the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, kind of a fancy way of saying it's like a stress barometer for sheep. Basically, the higher that ratio is, the more stressed out the animal is. And they also measured cortisol levels.
Cortisol, right. That's a key stress hormone. So after 3 months on their respective diets, what did they see? Were the Tritordium ewes less stressed?
They were. The ewes that were on the Tritordium diet, they had lower cortisol levels and a much healthier neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. Plus, their red blood cell counts were higher, which, is a good indicator of overall health.
So Tritordium seems to be doing something good for these pregnant ewes.
Right, and that's super important because a stressed ewe, that can lead to all sorts of problems, like maybe they have trouble giving birth or maybe they don't produce enough milk for their lamb. So anything we can do to keep those stress levels down is a good thing.
Absolutely. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about animal welfare in general before we move on to the second study. Why is this such a big topic these days?
Well, more and more people are starting to pay attention to where their food comes from and how the animals are being treated. They want to know that the animals they're eating had a good life,
Hmm.
that they weren't suffering unnecessarily.
Yeah, I think it's great that people are becoming more aware of that connection
Yeah,
between animal welfare and the quality of food we eat.
exactly. And good animal welfare, it's not just about, making sure they have food and a place to live. It's about really thinking about their needs, both physical and mental, and making sure their environment lets them thrive.
I love that. Okay, so on to that second study. This one looks at a different type of feed. It compares a new silage made from a cereal called DDRR to traditional corn silage. Can you tell us a little bit about DDRR?
Sure, DBRR is basically, it's a type of tetraploid teretical. It's another one of those, hardy grains, kind of like Tritordium, that do really well in tough conditions.
Okay, and why were they comparing this DDRR silage to corn silage?
Well, corn silage is like the go-to feed for sheep and other livestock, but it can sometimes be contaminated with something called mycotoxins.
Mycotoxins, those don't sound good. What exactly are those?
Oh, they're not good at all. They're basically these toxic compounds. They're produced by certain types of fungi, and these fungi can grow on crops like corn, and the worst part is they can actually make the animals sick.
Ah, so the researchers were worried about these mycotoxins being in the corn silage.
Yeah, they were. They wanted to see if this DDRR silage, which is less likely to get contaminated with mycotoxins, could be a safer, healthier option for the sheep.
That makes a lot of sense. And did they find what they were hoping for?
Well, that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive. You'll have to stay tuned to find out how that DDRR silage stacked up against the corn silage. And we'll talk more about those mycotoxins too.
Don't worry, we'll be back soon to break it all down for you. Okay, so we're back and ready to keep going with this Tritordeum deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about DDRR silage, remember? That new kind of silage. And how it compared to the traditional corn silage, especially with those mycotoxins lurking around. What happened with that?
Oh, the results were pretty interesting. They took 100 merino ewes and put them into 2 groups. One group got the DDRR silage and the other got the corn silage. And then they just watched them for 3 months.
Okay, and how did it go?
Well, the DDR silage group, those ewes were doing great. Like they gained a lot of weight and their body condition was better. It was clear they were doing well.
That's good news. But what about the ewes on the corn silage? Were they showing any signs of, problems from those mycotoxins?
Unfortunately, yeah. They didn't do nearly as well. Not only did they show some signs of stress, like higher cortisol levels and that neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio we were talking about.
Oh no, that's not good. So they were stressed, but was there any evidence that the mycotoxins were actually making them sick?
Yeah, there was. When they looked at the ewes' livers, the liver's really important for filtering out toxins, right? Well, the ewes that were on the corn silage, their livers showed actual signs of damage.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal. So it sounds like the DDRR silage with fewer mycotoxins was definitely a healthier choice.
Exactly. It really shows you how important it is to consider those mycotoxins when you're thinking about animal feed.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned before that these mycotoxins are produced by fungi. Can you tell me more about how those fungi get into the crops?
Sure. It all comes down to the fungi, really. They thrive in those warm, humid conditions. And they can start growing on crops like corn or wheat while they're still out in the field, or during storage, even during processing sometimes.
So they're kind of a hidden danger, like you might not even know they're there.
Right. And with climate change and everything, we're seeing higher temperatures,
Hmm.
and weird rain patterns. All of that is like a perfect recipe for these fungi to just take over. So mycotoxin contamination is becoming even more of a problem.
That's a little scary. So using something like DDRR, which is less likely to have those mycotoxins, that could be a real game changer for animal welfare then, especially with the climate changing so much.
Definitely. It's all about adapting and creating a stronger food system,
Yeah.
one where we can make sure the animals are getting safe and healthy food.
Yeah, and the benefits go beyond just animal health too, right? I mean, if the ewes on the DDRR silage were doing so well, that probably means that the food they produce is better too, right?
You got it. Healthier animals mean healthier food for us.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
It's also fascinating. But before we go too far down this rabbit hole of DDRR and Tritordeum, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how the researchers looked at animal welfare, that comprehensive approach. It wasn't just about weight gain or body condition. They were measuring a lot of different things.
Yeah, for sure. They were looking at like blood cell counts, enzyme levels, even immunoglobulin levels, which tell you about the immune system. They really wanted to understand the whole picture of the ewe's health.
It's amazing how much science can tell us about animal welfare now.
It really is. And this kind of research is so important if we want to move toward a food system that's sustainable and ethical.
Speaking of sustainability, we've talked a lot about how Tritordeum and DDRR are good for animal welfare. But what about their impact on the environment? How do they compare to, like, wheat or corn?
That's a great question. And it's something that researchers are really looking into right now. One of the good things about Tritordeum is that it doesn't need as much water or fertilizer as wheat, which is huge, especially in areas that don't have a lot of water.
So it could be better for the environment.
It looks like it, yeah. And remember, DDRR is a winter cereal, which means you can grow it during the cooler months when you don't have to water it as much. So it could be a really good alternative to corn, especially if you're worried about water conservation.
So these new grains could be like a triple win. Better for the animals, better for the environment, and better for us.
Exactly. It's pretty exciting to think about the possibilities.
I agree. But before we get too carried away, I want to step back and look at the bigger picture. What does all of this mean for the future of, livestock farming?
That's the million-dollar question,
Ah.
right? Are we going to see these new cereals replace the old ones? Will they help us create a food system that's better for everyone? Those are the questions that researchers and farmers are trying to figure out right now.
It's complicated, that's for sure. But I think the potential benefits of Tritordeum and DDRR are just too big to ignore.
I think so too. These studies have really opened our eyes to what's possible, and they've started a conversation about how we can create a better future for animals and the planet.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Tritordeum, DDRR, those mycotoxins, animal welfare, the future of farming. It's a lot. What are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that what we feed our animals really matters. It matters for their health, for the environment, and for the quality of the food we eat.
I completely agree. And these new cereals, they could really make a difference.
They could. They're not a perfect solution, of course, but they're a good step in the right direction, a step towards a food system that's more sustainable and humane.
And that's definitely something worth striving for.
And we're back for the final part of our Tritordium deep dive. It's been pretty fascinating learning about how these new cereals could really change things for animal welfare and create a food system that's better for everyone. We've talked about a lot, haven't we? Like the genetics of Tritordium and those mycotoxins that can be so dangerous in animal feed. But there's one more thing about these studies that I think is really important.
Oh, I'm curious. Tell me more.
It's about what happens when you really prioritize animal welfare. You know how the ewes on the Tritordium and DDRR diets were healthier and less stressed? Well, it turns out those benefits can actually spread beyond just the animal itself.
Right, like healthier, happier animals probably mean healthier food for us too, right? But it's not just about the nutrition, is it?
Exactly. When you raise animals in a way that takes care of their well-being, it can actually improve the quality and safety of the food they produce. For instance, if a ewe is less stressed, it can lead to better quality lamb meat and wool.
Oh, that makes sense. And it all ties back to what we were talking about before, how people are paying more attention to where their food comes from and how it's produced.
Absolutely. People are really into that farm-to-table idea these days, and they're definitely willing to pay more for food that they know was produced ethically and sustainably.
So if farmers are using cereals like Tritordium and DDRR in their animal feed, that could be a really good way to attract those conscious consumers.
It really could. It's like a win-win-win situation.
Yeah.
Healthier animals, better quality products, and a more sustainable way of farming.
Okay, so it sounds like these new cereals have a lot of potential. But let's be real for a second. There are always challenges when it comes to changing the way we do things in agriculture, right?
Of course. One of the biggest ones is scale. Can we actually produce enough Tritordium and DDRR to meet the needs of the whole livestock industry worldwide? That's something researchers and farmers are working on right now.
And then there's the money side of things, right? It can be expensive for farmers to switch to new crops. Can they really do it without putting a strain on their finances?
That's a good point. And we also have to think about whether consumers are willing to pay more for products made with these new sustainable grains.
It's complicated, that's for sure. But I do feel optimistic. I mean, the benefits of Tritordium and DDRR seem so important.
I agree. These studies have really opened our eyes to what's possible, and they've started a conversation about how we can build a better future for animals and the planet as a whole.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Exploring these big questions and getting our listeners to think critically about the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with a question to think about. Based on everything we've learned today, how do you see Tritordium and DDRR shaping the future of food?
That's a great question. Will they completely change the way we raise animals and produce food? Or will they just be a small part of the market?
I guess we'll have to wait and see. But one thing's certain, the journey toward a more sustainable and humane food system isn't over, and we all have a part to play in it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Tritordium and DDRR. And until next time, keep those minds curious.